Good day from New York. Sarah and I are here to share with you some of our experience and our opinions of the recent Forum on Financing for Development, which was held here from the 22nd to the 25th of May. Now, financing for development, right, if we think about it, we think of how our countries actually get their finance or access funds for the development of their country, of the people. So, and it's very different in different parts of the world and in different countries, right? But there are four main areas which I'll just name so that you can be aware of them as we speak about them. First of all, there's always the question of domestic resources. You know, what domestic resources does a country have to be able to fund its services to its people? There's also international public resources. We all know that we have to borrow money, or usually have to borrow money from other countries and from other governments. And then there's, on the other hand, the whole private business sector, where we can have domestic private resources and international private resources, and as we know, that's huge and can be very contentious. But we went into all of that in great depth at this forum. So I'll just hand you to Sarah now, just for some of your kind of feelings or your experience of it, and what you found challenging and good, shall we say.
Sure.
Right, so go ahead.
Thank
there.
you.
Yes.
Yeah, so there were two cross-cutting issues that seemed to come up again and again throughout the forum. And the first was about women's participation in the economy, and I guess maybe a recognition of the lack of planning for women when it comes to development, and especially financing for development. So there was a push by NGOs to really include gender equality in planning and women's participation in the economy to a greater extent. And in some respects, this was acknowledged. Like there were different participants. So there was like the World Bank. There were people from international financial institutions, from member states, from the private sector. And so some of these groups did acknowledge the role of women, but often it was with respect to their earning capacity, I would say, and maybe more so in terms of the tax revenue that they could bring to the state. Whereas the NGO voices really tried to point out that women are doing a lot of unpaid work. So you talk about the domestic work, the care work that women do all around the world, and how this is unpaid labor, basically. And there was a recognition of the fact that there isn't enough money in the world to pay for all of the work that women do. So, you know, maybe we need to consider some of this kind of unpaid labor when we talk about planning and financing for development, that this is a crucial part. That women are subsidizing economies around the world through their unpaid labor. So we need to recognize this and incorporate it more into our development conversations, perhaps, and the planning that we're doing.
Yes.
And then the second cross-cutting issue was the focus on the private sector. And so I think there was a real recognition of the fact that the private sector as an instrumental player when it comes to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and certainly in terms of increasing economic growth, you know, around the world. But then there's also sort of on the flip side, like there's these benefits of economic growth, but then there's also these other kinds of effects that can occur when we really rely on the private sector to generate income. And so NGOs were raising awareness about the fact that in development circles, I guess, these days, there's a real push for what we call private-public partnerships, or PPPs. They also talked about it being blended finance, so it's financing, like money coming from the private sector and the public sector, generally focusing on like public sector projects. So whether it's an infrastructure, like could be health services, it could be education, it could be things like road construction, but really relying heavily on private sector to provide the funding for it. And so there's concern from the NGO environment that the private sector interests are being put ahead of the public interest. So where there is maybe more concern about what is best for shareholders or stakeholders in corporations versus what is in the interest of the people and really what their development needs are. So that was a really big concern that was raised throughout the forum as well.
Yes. When you speak about the interests of the people, one of the issues I think that came up over and over again is the whole question of what they call illicit flows of money. Now, one of the areas that I think is trying to be pushed quite a lot is the question of domestic resource mobilization. Mm-hmm. Now, that means that each country tries to get its act together to begin with and to tax correctly and all that involves, so that it can have a good amount of domestic resources, to help for the basic services especially. So, but anyway, this is all linked up with what's called illicit financial flows. And a lot of that, now, for example, Africa is the prime example in which much more money flows out of Africa than what is actually given to Africa in aid. We often think of the amount of money that is given in aid, but in actual fact what comes out of Africa is much more, and a whole lot of that is illicit flow. A lot of it has to do with trade mispricing. Now, we can imagine what trade mispricing is if you're dealing with a country and a massive corporation, international corporation, what can happen there. There's another part of it which is tax evasion, which happens in every country around the world, and then the question of corruption. So all of that together, and it's corruption on all sides. It isn't that one particular country or one particular continent. The question of corruption is huge, and all of that just disempowers the ordinary people, because you're left without the resources that should be used for you in your country. Now, a really interesting thing is we had a specific session on corruption, and one of the things that I hadn't been that much aware of, but I was saying, oh my goodness, like the UN actually, there is a convention on corruption and crime, and that deals with the recovery of stolen assets. Now, what happens? You have this convention, but countries have to sign on if they want it to be legally binding in their country, right? Then the number of countries that have signed on is not very significant. So anyway, I think it was last year, actually, the General Assembly, in one of its resolutions, and resolutions are used to kind of encourage countries to act on them. And there was a resolution basically inviting countries to sign on to this convention on corruption and crime. So that's kind of the way we are. The question of good governance, bad governance, that was, I think, present in all the conversations. The question of weak institutions. If the institutions are weak, it's really difficult for a country to get ahead. And then, like, what kind of help do we all need? What kind of help can we give each other as countries? That, I think, was an important part of what we were trying to say as well. So I found that part was really kind of fascinating, to be quite honest. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Just on a personal note, I guess I really enjoyed this forum, actually, even though sometimes some of the topics maybe were a little bit dry because they became very technical, discussing different types of bonds and loans, and some of that conversation kind of went over my head. But overall, I just found the whole process really fascinating, because in this forum, you're bringing together all these different players that maybe wouldn't necessarily come together. It's a very unique opportunity for people to come. And what I noticed is that, we had, like I said before, we have international financial institutions. We have the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and others present. We have the UN system, so some of the different organizations within the UN that work on development. We have private sector, so there were banks and other corporations there. We have the NGOs, so we have civil society. And then we have member states, so different governments were present too. Yeah. And I got the sense that everybody seems to be on board, more or less, with the SDGs, and are agreed that we want to achieve this. Everybody's agreed this is a very ambitious agenda to achieve by 2030. But what I noticed, and is that obviously these different sectors, everybody has their own viewpoint of how we achieve these goals. In some cases it's, we want to have unfettered market access, to allow for growth, economic growth, and this is what's going to bring us forward. Other areas are more hesitant to allow the market to kind of dictate or guide us, in terms of achieving these goals. But what I really appreciated was just that there is this space that people can come together and talk about these things. I think that's what is so unique about the United Nations, is that people can come together and talk about these issues and try to come to some kind of solution or an agreement of how to move forward, and that these are ongoing conversations. But what I noticed, and this is something that I observed from the previous forum we attended in April, so the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, was how important the individual voices are. We heard from different Indigenous groups, like representatives from different groups coming in talking about their own experiences, and to some extent I think that this forum could really benefit from that, like from hearing from people on the ground. I know that NGOs do represent certain groups, certain people, but I think having individuals coming in sharing their experiences would be that much more enriching for the conversation, and especially Indigenous groups, Indigenous peoples, because like we learned at the Permanent Forum, that they're on the front lines of some of these major changes that are occurring in this world, the front lines of development, and they're experiencing climate change in a disproportionate way. So really having these voices contributing to this discussion, I think, would add a certain, richness, and would provide so much more, I think, learning. We could maybe make better decisions, or more informed decisions if we had some other individual voices, sharing successes, but also sharing the struggles.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's really important. And another little interesting point that I noticed, that recently they're trying to bring in a different way, it's local authorities, because local authorities, we haven't been so aware of their situation and the kind of tensions they have, with national government, and that's kind of being spoken about there, and hopefully, they'll be able to advance on that. So there was like that, and then there's the whole world of science and technology that they're bringing in as well to make them part of the conversation. So it's really creating, as you say, bringing people together, creating that forum where you can have all these amazing exchanges, so that hopefully we can all move forward together.
Yes.
So that's it. Yeah. Right. So we leave it there, and let's hope that this is helpful and that you enjoy it.